Midnight in Northumberland. The wind off the Cheviot Hills carries the sound of yew branches against stone. Chillingham Castle stands in a hollow between the hills, 8 centuries old, and for most of those centuries it has held back the worst men ever did to each other on the English border. The torture chamber is still there. Not a reconstruction, the original. Racks, iron maidens, branding irons hung on hooks where the jailer left them. Some of them have rust stains. Some of them have stains that aren't rust. They call this the most haunted castle in Britain. A blue boy who appears at the stroke of midnight, a gray lady who walks the pantry, a torturer named John Sage whose footsteps still ring on the stone floor where he killed. The current owner has lived here since 1982. He gives ghost tours by candlelight. He has also, quietly, stopped sleeping in the castle. The real question isn't whether the ghosts are real. The real question is what they remember. To understand what they remember, you have to understand where you are. Northumberland is the northernmost county of England. It runs from the North Sea on its eastern edge to the Cheviot Hills on its western, and from the River Tyne in the south to the River Tweed in the north. The Tweed is the border. Cross the Tweed, and you are in Scotland, have always been in Scotland, have always, on some level, been an enemy. Chillingham sits 12 miles inland from the coast and roughly 15 miles south of the Tweed. Far enough from Scotland to belong to England, close enough to Scotland to die for that distinction. The castle is not on a hill. That is the first surprise. The great castles of England, Bamburgh, Warkworth, Alnwick, are built on cliffs and high ground, designed to be seen for miles. Chillingham is built in a hollow. You have to be almost upon it before it appears. Ancient yew trees crowd around the walls. The road bends through the trees, and the castle simply rises out of the green. A quadrangular gray fortress with 4 corner towers, a moat now mostly silted in, and walls thick enough that no cannon ever brought them down. There is a reason it is built like this. The reason is in beat 2 of this story. But before we go there, walk through the gate with me. The courtyard is small and shadowed. The cobbles are uneven where 800 years of feet have worn them. There is a stone porch over the door that leads to the great hall. Above the porch, carved into the lintel, is the Grey family motto, and above the motto a coat of arms so old the heraldry has weathered to suggestion. Inside, the great hall is wood-paneled and dark. There are suits of armor against the walls. There are weapons crossed over the fireplace. There is a long oak table that has been in this room since the reign of Henry VIII. Below the great hall, accessible by a narrow stone stair, is the dungeon. And inside the dungeon, set behind an iron grille, is the torture chamber. This is the room that anchors the legend. This is the room that the ghost tours visit at midnight. This is the room where, the stories say, John Sage worked for King Edward I in the closing years of the 13th century, taking captured Scottish soldiers and breaking them apart on instruments still hanging on the walls. We will come back to John Sage. We will come back to the chamber. But the chamber doesn't make sense by itself. To understand the chamber, and the ghosts in the chamber, and what the owner is no longer willing to sleep above, you have to understand the border. Imagine a line on a map. A modern line. A line drawn by treaties and respected by armies, with customs houses and passport checks, and a clear understanding on both sides of who governs which side. Imagine the line between Scotland and England in the year 2026. Now erase it. The border between Scotland and England, as it existed for most of the Middle Ages, was not a line. It was a zone. It was roughly 80 miles long, running from the Solway Firth in the west to the Tweed in the east, and it was somewhere between 10 and 30 miles deep on each side. Inside that zone, the writ of the King of Scotland was thin, and the writ of the King of England was thin, and the writ of whichever family could field the most riders on a winter night was, for practical purposes, the only law. This zone had a name. They called it the Debatable Lands. The phrase first appears in records in the 15th century, and it referred to one particular stretch of land in the west where ownership was so contested that it was officially declared, by both crowns, to belong to neither. But the spirit of the name covered the whole frontier. The whole border was debatable. The whole border was a place where the rules of medieval Europe, the rules of feudal allegiance, of crown justice, of church protection, were thinner than smoke. This was not a temporary condition. This was the condition for 300 years. It began in 1296. In that year, King Edward I of England, who would later be called Longshanks for his height and Hammer of the Scots for what he did to them, invaded Scotland. The pretext was a succession dispute over the Scottish crown. The reality was that Edward had decided to do to Scotland what he had already done to Wales: annex it, garrison it, and absorb it into a single English kingdom from the Channel to the Highlands. He sacked the Scottish town of Berwick on the Tweed, fewer than 20 miles from where Chillingham now stands. The chroniclers, English chroniclers, writing for an English king, said that between 7,000 and 17,000 civilians were killed in the 3 days the soldiers were allowed to run loose in Berwick. The exact number is impossible to verify. What is verifiable is that Berwick before 1296 was the wealthiest port in Scotland, larger than Edinburgh, and that after 1296 it was rubble. This was the opening. From 1296 until 1603, with brief lulls and longer storms, the border between England and Scotland was at war. Not always full war between the two crowns, but always war between the families who lived there. Always raids, always burning, always the smoke on the horizon at dawn. 300 years, 12 generations of people who were born into smoke and grew old into smoke and were buried while their grandchildren rode out to make new smoke on someone else's farm. This is the world Chillingham was built for. This is the world Chillingham was built into. A castle in this country was not a luxury. A castle was an answer to a specific question, and the question was, when the riders come, where do the women and the children and the cattle go? Every village in the border country had a fortified tower. Every farmhouse had thick walls and narrow windows. Every church had a defensible roof and a stone belfry. And the wealthy families, the families who claimed land in this country and wanted to keep claiming it, built castles. The Greys built Chillingham. But before we go to the Greys, we need to talk about the people the Greys were defending against. We need to talk about who actually rode the smoke. Because the standard story of the border, English crown versus Scottish crown, English nobles versus Scottish nobles, is not the story the people who lived there would have told. The people who lived there would have told you the names of the surnames. There is a word in English. The word is asterisk blackmail asterisk. We use it today to describe a particular crime, the extortion of money or favors by threatening to expose a secret. It is one of those English words that sounds modern, that sounds almost slang, but is in fact much older than most of us realize. The word comes from the border. The word comes from this country, this frontier, in roughly the 15th century. Asterisk mail asterisk, in the old Northern English, meant a payment, a rent, money owed for something. Asterisk black asterisk meant illegal, illicit, dark, the color the other side of moral. Asterisk blackmail asterisk was the money you paid the riders not to come. You paid them in the autumn, after the harvest, and if you paid them they would leave your farm alone over the winter. If you did not pay them, they would come in the dark and take your cattle and burn your roof and, if you were unlucky, take a child for ransom or leave your husband bleeding in the doorway. It was a protection racket. It was organized crime 400 years before anyone called it organized crime. And the people who ran it had names. They had surnames. You have to understand that on the border, your surname was not just your father's name. Your surname was your nation. Your surname was your army. Your surname decided whether you lived past 40 and whether your children ate in the winter, and whether, when you died, anyone would come to bury you or only to take your boots. The great Reiver surnames, and historians today list somewhere between 60 and 100 of them, included the Armstrongs of Liddesdale, the Elliots of Larriston, the Charltons of Tyndale, the Grahams of the Esk, the Kerrs of Cessford, the Scotts of Buccleuch, the Nixons, the Crosers, the Bells, the Forsters, the Hetheringtons, the Routledges, the Burns. Some of these surnames you will recognize. There is a reason. When King James VI of Scotland became King James I of England in 1603 and finally crushed the Reiver families, about which more later, he scattered them. He hanged the leaders. He transported the followers to Ireland, to the new plantation of Ulster, where their descendants would, 100 years later, sail to America and become a substantial fraction of the early frontier population of the American colonies. The Reiver surnames did not die out. They emigrated. Some of the family names on the American frontier in the 18th century, the Armstrongs, The Grahams, the Kerrs, were the same families who, 200 years earlier, had been burning farms within sight of Chillingham. But that is later. In the years we are now in, the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, these surnames were not yet diaspora. They were a present tense problem. The Armstrongs of Liddesdale, on the Scottish side, could field by the early 16th century 3,000 mounted men. 3,000. For comparison, the standing Royal Army of Scotland in the same period rarely exceeded 10,000. The Armstrongs alone were a third of the kingdom's military potential, and they did not answer to the kingdom. They answered to the Armstrong name. The Elliots, the Armstrongs' neighbors and allies, could field perhaps another 2,000. The Grahams, who held the debatable lands proper in the west, could field something similar. These were not bandits. These were nations within nations. They had their own laws. They had their own courts, called *days of truce*, where Reiver families on opposing sides of the border would meet to negotiate the return of stolen cattle and the ransom of kidnapped relatives. They had their own marriage customs, frequently across the border, so that an Armstrong of the Scottish side might marry a Charlton of the English side and produce children whose loyalty was, by birth, debatable. And they raided. They raided constantly. The standard pattern was a winter raid, when the nights were long and the cattle were stalled in barns where they were easy to find. A party of riders, anywhere from 20 to 200 depending on the target, would ride out at dusk, cross 15 or 30 miles of country in the dark, hit a chosen farm or village at first light, take what they could move, kill anyone who fought, and be back across the border by the next dusk. The raid would be followed, sometimes, by a counter-raid by the wronged family. The counter-raid would be followed by a hot trod, the legal pursuit of stolen goods across the border, allowed by treaty up to a depth of 6 miles. The hot trod would sometimes catch the raiders. More often it would not. This was the rhythm of the country. This was the country into which the Greys of Chillingham were born. The Grey family arrives in the historical record of Chillingham in the early 13th century. The exact date of the first Grey on the site is debated. There was almost certainly a fortified structure here before they came, a wooden palisade, perhaps a stone tower. But the castle as a quadrangular fortress, as the building you can walk through today, dates to the early 14th century, and the family who built it were the Greys. They were not, originally, an especially powerful family. They were minor northern gentry, the kind of family that held a few thousand acres and a knight's fee and was expected to provide a certain number of armed men when the king called. What raised them was the border. The border raised them because the border ate every family that was not raised by it. A family in Northumberland in the 13th and 14th centuries had 3 options. Option 1. It could be too small to defend itself, in which case it would be swept away within a generation or two, its farms burned, its women carried off, its men killed or absorbed into stronger surnames. Option 2. It could become a Reiver family itself, joining the riders, building its wealth on raid and ransom, accepting that it would be hanged eventually but eating well in the meantime. Or Option 3. It could become big enough, hard enough, well fortified enough, that no Reiver party would seriously think of trying it. It could become a fortress family. The Greys chose Option 3. They built Chillingham. They built it square, with 4 corner towers, with walls between 11 and 14 feet thick at the base, with a moat fed by the burn that runs through the hollow, with a portcullis and a drawbridge and a barbican. They built it specifically to be too expensive to attack. A party of 200 Reivers might burn a farm and ride away with 20 cattle. The same party trying Chillingham would have to dismount, surround the walls, assault the gate, take the courtyard against archers in the towers, fight room to room through stone corridors against armed Greys and armed Grey retainers, and at the end of it, if they succeeded, the alarm would have spread for miles and the Wardens of the march would already be riding. Nobody tried Chillingham. For 3 centuries, almost without exception, nobody seriously tried Chillingham. The Greys grew because of this. They grew because they were the family that didn't burn. They acquired land from neighbors whose castles did burn, whose lines did fail, whose daughters married into the Grey name in search of safety. They acquired royal favor because they were one of the families the crown could rely on to actually be there in the morning when the king's army marched through. By the 15th century they were knights. By the 16th century, they were barons. By the 17th century, they were earls, earls of Tankerville, and they would hold that title, with one interruption, until the line failed in the 20th. The family had its share of dark men. Sir Thomas Grey, the second Lord Grey of Chillingham, was executed in 1415 for plotting against King Henry V on the eve of Henry's invasion of France. He was beheaded outside Southampton 3 days before Henry sailed for Agincourt. The Grey estates were forfeit. They were restored to his son a few years later, but the family carried the memory of having lost their head once and being permitted to keep it the second time. Another Sir Thomas Grey, 4 generations later, was a leading agent of the English crown in the Anglo-Scottish wars of the 16th century. He led punitive expeditions across the Tweed. He served as Warden of the East March, the crown's chief enforcer in the eastern third of the border, and he ordered, under that authority, executions and burnings that were considered extreme even by the standards of the time. He died in his bed at Chillingham, which was more than most bordermen managed. The point of this brief genealogy is not the Greys themselves. The point is what the Greys' survival actually meant. It meant that Chillingham, for 300 years, was a working instrument of border violence. It was not a passive refuge that the Reivers happened to leave alone. It was an active fortress, garrisoned and armed and continuously used by the English crown as one of the platforms from which the border was held against Scotland and against Scottish allied Reiver families. The Greys were not innocent bystanders to the violence of the frontier. The Greys were one of the engines of it. This matters because of what was happening inside the walls. The Reivers burned farms outside. The Greys, on behalf of various kings of England, did something else inside. And what they did inside is what the dungeon remembers. But before we get to the dungeon, we have to go back to one specific year. We have to go back to the king who slept at Chillingham on his way to break Scotland, and who left, the legend says, the worst of his men behind. We have to go back to 1298. Edward I of England was a tall man. He was, by the measurements taken when his tomb was opened in 1774, 6 feet and 2 inches in height, which in the 13th century, when the average male height was around 5 feet 7, was extraordinary. His nickname, Longshanks, comes from this. He was also, in the surviving descriptions from people who met him, broad-shouldered, dark-haired in youth, and white-haired late, with a slight droop in one eyelid that had a way of making him look both sleepy and contemptuous at once. He was the kind of man who, when he entered a room, settled the room. He was 58 years old in the summer of 1298, which was old for a king of his era. He had been on the English throne for 26 years. He had crushed the Welsh princes in the 1280s and built the great ring of castles around Wales, Conwy, Carnarvon, Harlech, Beaumaris, that we covered in week 10 of this series. He had reformed English law and English finance. He had also, by 1298, decided that Scotland was the next country he intended to incorporate. The first invasion, in 1296, had succeeded. Berwick had fallen. The Scottish king, John Balliol, had been forced to abdicate. Edward had carried off the Stone of Scone, the ancient inauguration stone of Scottish kings, and installed it under his throne at Westminster. He had appointed English administrators over Scotland and gone home, thinking the matter was settled. It was not settled. In 1297, a knight named William Wallace, from a relatively obscure family in the west of Scotland, raised a rebellion. He defeated an English army at Stirling Bridge in September of that year. He liberated most of Scotland in a campaign that lasted 6 months. By the spring of 1298, he had effective control of the country and was raiding deep into northern England. Edward came north personally to deal with him. The campaign of summer 1298 was a massive English military effort. Edward brought 25,000 men, including a significant contingent of Welsh longbowmen, freshly subjugated and pressed into English service, across the border. He marched north, through Northumberland, through the country we are now in. He needed places to billet his army and his court along the way. He needed castles whose lords he could trust. He stopped at Chillingham. The records suggest, in the late spring or early summer of 1298, on his northward march. He may have stopped again on his southward march in the autumn, after the campaign was concluded. He used Chillingham, the way kings used the seats of their loyal barons, as a forward base. He held court here. He received reports from his scouts here. He gave orders for the next phase of the march here. And then, on July 22nd, 1298, his army caught Wallace's army at a place called Falkirk in central Scotland, and Edward broke it. The English longbowmen, the same ones who would later devastate the French at Crécy and Agincourt, were used here for the first time in a major battle, and they did what they would do at Crécy and Agincourt. They cut a packed enemy formation to pieces at range. The Scottish spearmen were slaughtered. Wallace escaped. The rebellion did not. Within months, Edward was back at Chillingham on his way south, with a victory behind him and a campaign whose harvest of prisoners, captured Scottish soldiers, captured Scottish guerrillas, captured Scottish sympathizers, needed somewhere to go. This is the historical fact. Edward was here. The campaign happened. Prisoners were taken. The legend begins where the historical fact ends. The legend says that one of the men in Edward's retinue, a sergeant-at-arms, a professional soldier of low birth and high ambition, a man whose name in the legend is John Sage, was given Chillingham's dungeon as his working office. The legend says that for the next 2 years, until Sage himself fell out of the king's favor, captured Scots were brought to Chillingham and broken in the chamber below the Great Hall, on instruments still hanging on the walls today. The legend gives Sage a body count: 7,000. The number is round, suspiciously round, the kind of round number that legends carry. The legend gives Sage a death. It says he was hanged at Chillingham at the orders of Edward himself, in the 2nd year of the new century, for the murder of his own lover, a Scottish woman he had taken from the prisoners and kept and then killed in a quarrel. The legend says his ghost still walks the chamber where he killed. We will deal with John Sage in his own chapter. We will deal with what is verifiable and what is not. For now, the point is this. Edward came north in 1298. He stopped at Chillingham. He used Chillingham. And whatever happened in the dungeon afterwards, whether John Sage was a real man or a folk-tale embroidery on real cruelty, there is no doubt that captured Scots passed through Chillingham in the years around 1298, and there is no doubt that not all of them passed through alive. The chamber is still there. The instruments are still on the walls. There is an architectural principle in medieval English castles. It is rarely written down, but it is visible in stone. The principle is this: a castle's wealth is in its great hall, and a castle's truth is in its dungeon. The great hall is where the guests are entertained. The dungeon is where the guests' enemies are kept. The great hall has tapestries and oak paneling and a high fire. The dungeon has a stone floor with a drain. At Chillingham, the great hall is on the ground floor of the South Range. It is a long room, perhaps 60 feet by 25 feet, with a high-beamed ceiling. The walls are paneled in dark oak. There is a stone fireplace large enough to roast a whole deer. There is a minstrel's gallery at one end where musicians once played for diners. There are weapons crossed over the doors: pikes, halberds, a brace of muskets from the 17th century, a crusader's sword that may or may not have been to Jerusalem. This is the room the visitors see first. This is the room the Greys built for their wealth. The dungeon is below. To reach it, you go through a small door at the side of the great hall, down a narrow stone staircase that turns once on itself into a corridor where the temperature drops noticeably, and the smell, even today, 800 years after the smell first formed, has a thin metallic edge. The corridor ends at an iron grill. The grill opens into a chamber roughly 20 feet by 15 feet, with a low ceiling, with a single window at ground level outside that admits a slot of gray light, with walls so thick that the sound of the great hall above does not reach. This is the torture chamber. The instruments are still in it. There is the rack, a long wooden frame with rollers at each end, on which a man could be tied at the wrists and ankles and slowly stretched until his shoulders and hips dislocated. The Chillingham rack is darkened with age and patched in 2 places where the wood split centuries ago and was repaired. The ropes have rotted away and been replaced for display, but the rollers and the frame are original. There is the Iron Maiden, or what is called an Iron Maiden, though the term is somewhat anachronistic for the period. What survives at Chillingham is a coffin-shaped iron casing with inward-pointing spikes set into the lid, into which a man could be sealed standing up and crushed slowly as the lid was closed. Modern historians dispute whether iron maidens of this kind were ever actually used in medieval Europe. There is some evidence that they are early modern theatrical inventions, built later than the periods to which they are popularly attributed. The Chillingham Iron Maiden may be original. It may be a 16th century or 17th century addition. The current owner declines to say definitively. He will tell you only that it has been in the chamber as long as he has owned the castle, and that it has been in the chamber, according to family inventories, since at least the 1830s. There are branding irons on the wall. There are pliers and pincers of various sizes. There is a small iron device with a curved beak that is described in the castle's own literature as a tongue-tierer. It would be fitted into the open mouth of a prisoner whose tongue would then be drawn out and severed. There is a chair with iron points set into the seat and the back and the arms, called locally the witch's chair, in which a prisoner could be strapped and made to sit for hours or days. There are leg irons, there are wrist irons, there are devices whose purposes are no longer known. And there is the rust. The torture chamber has rust on almost every iron surface. This is unsurprising. Iron, exposed to the damp air of an underground Northumberland chamber for several hundred years, will rust. What is more difficult is that not all of the discoloration on the metal looks like rust. Some of it has a brownish undertone that is the wrong shade. Some of it is in patches on the wood of the rack that the eye reads, immediately, as something other than corrosion. The current owner, asked about this on the ghost tours, gives an answer that walks an honest line. He will tell you that the chamber has been used. He will tell you that what was done in it was done 800 years ago, and 400 years ago, and 200 years ago. He will tell you that the staining on the wood may be many things, and that he has chosen not to have it scientifically tested, because he does not want the answer. This is the chamber. This is the room directly below the Great Hall, 20 feet of stone separating the music and the wine and the velvet from the iron and the rope and the drain. This is what the Greys built into their fortress. In the years between the founding of the castle in the early 14th century and the closing of the chamber as an active facility, which was probably sometime in the late 17th century, after the Union of the Crowns had removed the political reasons to keep such a room operating. The chamber would not be reopened to the public until the 20th century. Sir Humphry Wakefield, the current owner, was not the first to display it. The earlier 19th century Greys had occasionally shown the dungeon to visitors as a curiosity, but Wakefield was the first to lean fully into the chamber as the spine of the visitor experience, and he was the first to combine the chamber with the ghost stories, and he was the first to invite paying guests to walk through the chamber by candlelight at midnight. The chamber is a working part of the modern castle's economy. The chamber is also, by every account the visitors give, the room where the cold is wrong. The temperature in the chamber, measured against the temperature of the corridor outside, is consistently lower by 4 to 7 degrees Celsius, even on warm summer days. There is a simple physical explanation. The chamber is below ground, with thick walls, in a part of the building that does not catch sun. There is also a folkloric explanation, which is that the chamber is colder because of what is still in it. The visitors will tell you, again and again, that they feel watched in this room. They will tell you they hear footsteps that are not theirs. They will tell you the candles flicker when there is no draft to flicker them. Whether these reports are evidence of haunting or evidence of suggestion, 21st century adults given a candle and told, in a dark stone chamber, that a torturer named John Sage is watching, is a question we cannot settle from outside. What we can say is that the reports are consistent. They have been consistent for at least 150 years. They were consistent in the 1870s, when Victorian guests at Chillingham first began to write about strange experiences in the dungeon. They are consistent today. Something happens in that room. What that something is the question this video cannot finally answer. But before we go to the question of the ghosts, we have to go to the question of what put them there. We have to go to the river centuries. If you stand at Chillingham today and look north and west, on a clear morning you can see the Cheviot Hills. They are not high mountains. The highest peak, the Cheviot itself, is just over 2,600 feet, but they are bare and rounded and exposed, and they were, for 300 years, the highway of the Reivers. The raiders came over the Cheviots. They came in parties of 20, 50, 200, occasionally larger. They came on small, hardy horses called *hobbies*, bred for endurance over speed, capable of carrying a man and his equipment for 30 miles in a winter night without exhausting. They came armed with a particular combination of weapons, a steel cap called a *burgonet*, a quilted jacket called a *jack*, sometimes a chainmail shirt under the jack, a long spear called a *latch*, a sword at the hip, occasionally a pistol or a wheel-lock carbine. In the later centuries, when such things became available, they came at dusk. They rode through the night. They hit a chosen target at first light. They were back across the border by the following dusk. Their targets were, in order of preference, cattle, sheep, horses, household goods, money, and people. The first four were the bread and butter of the raid. The fifth was a bonus. The sixth, people, was a specialized business. A man taken alive by a Reiver party could be ransomed back to his family, sometimes for hundreds of pounds. A woman taken alive could be held for ransom or, less commonly, married off. There are documented cases of border women being abducted, married to a Reiver of the opposing side, and folded into the kidnapping family's surname permanently. Children were the most valuable hostages of all. The ransom for a child was higher than the ransom for an adult, because a family that would not pay to recover a husband or a brother would almost always pay to recover a son. The numbers are difficult to fix. The Wardens' records, and we will get to the Wardens in a moment, survive in patches from the 14th century onward. They list specific raids, they list specific damages claimed by the victims. From these patches, historians have been able to estimate the order of magnitude of the violence. Between 1300 and 1603, the most cautious estimate is that something like 100,000 people were killed in border raids and counter-raids and Reiver feuds on both sides of the Tweed. The high estimate is closer to 300,000. The territory in which these deaths occurred contained, at most periods, perhaps 100,000 people total. The implication is that, generation by generation, the border country lost a significant fraction of its population to violence, and the population that survived because it had learned, by inheritance and necessity, to absorb the violence into the rhythm of normal life. Chillingham sat in the middle of this. Chillingham did not absorb the raids the way an undefended farm absorbed them. Chillingham resisted, but Chillingham was also, by the 15th and 16th centuries, one of the institutional engines of the English side of the violence. The Greys provided men, the Greys provided supplies. The Greys provided, on behalf of the English crown, the legal authority under which captured Scots and captured Reivers and captured suspected Reiver sympathizers could be questioned, detained, and, in the dungeon, broken. The legal authority was the Warden of the March system. The border was divided, by both crowns, into three administrative zones called marches: the East March, the Middle March, and the West March, running west from the Tweed and Berwick to the Solway Firth. Each march had a warden on the English side and a warden on the Scottish side. The warden's job was to keep order in his march, to pursue stolen goods across the border under the days of truce conventions, and to administer summary justice to captured Reivers when he could. The Greys of Chillingham produced multiple wardens of the East March across the 15th and 16th centuries. Sir Ralph Grey served as warden in the 1450s. Sir Thomas Grey served in the 1530s. The position carried with it the legal authority to interrogate suspected Reivers. The chamber under Chillingham's Great Hall was, in this period, one of the places where that authority was practiced. The records do not describe the chamber's use in detail. Wardens did not generally write down the methods by which they extracted confessions from captured Scots. But the records do describe outcomes. They describe captured Reivers brought to specific castles, including Chillingham, and held for periods of weeks or months. They describe confessions extracted, accomplices named, raids planned that were thereafter prevented because the captives talked. They describe, occasionally and obliquely, prisoners who died in custody. The standard formula in the records is died of his hurts, or did not survive his examination, The euphemism is a euphemism. We know what it means. This was not a hidden process. The warden system was an official, crown-sanctioned method of keeping order on a frontier the crown could not otherwise hold. The chamber under Chillingham was, in this period, performing a function that the English state required and approved. The historical record will not tell us how many men died in the Chillingham dungeon over the 3 centuries it was in active use. The records were not kept. The estimates can only be in the hundreds, possibly into the low thousands, across the full span. The numbers cannot be precise. What can be said precisely is that the room was working. The room was open for business. The instruments were not decoration, they were tools, and the tools were used. This is the historical layer underneath the John Sage legend. The John Sage legend may or may not be true. There is no contemporary documentary evidence that a man by that name worked the chamber in 1298 and 1299 on the orders of Edward Longshanks. His name does not appear in any surviving royal record of the period. His 7,000 victims is a folk number, the kind of round, impossible figure that legend manufactures. But the chamber was real. The torture was real. The dead were real. The 7,000 is not the count of John Sage's victims. The 7,000 is the order of magnitude of the violence the chamber witnessed over its full operating life, attributed in folk memory to a single named man because folk memory always wants a face to attach the horror to. The face folk memory chose was John Sage. It is time to look at him. There is a version of this story that I cannot tell you in good conscience without first telling you what we know and what we do not. What we know is that the legend of John Sage at Chillingham was already circulating in the early 19th century. It appears in print in regional Northumbrian guidebooks of the 1840s and 1850s. It was elaborated by Victorian ghost hunters and antiquarians in the second half of that century. It was carried into the 20th century by tourist literature, and it was given its modern shape by the Chillingham ghost tours of the last 40 years. What we do not know is whether John Sage existed. There is no contemporary record of a man by that name in the service of King Edward I. There is no entry in the surviving royal accounts. There is no mention in the chronicles. There is no Chillingham estate record from the relevant period naming him as a member of the household. He does not appear in the patent rolls, the close rolls, or the published collections of Edward's military correspondence. He is, from a historian's point of view, a man we cannot verify. That does not mean he did not exist. The 13th century documentary record is incomplete. Many people, including many soldiers and minor officials, are not in it. A sergeant-at-arms of low birth and no particular property would be exactly the kind of man the medieval English state would not bother to record at length. He could have existed and simply not have been written down. But the burden of evidence falls on the side of folklore, not history. So this is what I will do. I will tell you the legend in its full form. I will tell it the way the candlelight tours tell it. And then, alongside the legend, I will tell you what the records do say about Chillingham's role in the wars of 1298 and 1299. The two things, the legend and the documented context, are doing different jobs. They are both true in their own ways. They are simply not the same kind of truth. The legend, then. The legend says that John Sage was a soldier of common birth from the south of England, perhaps Somerset, perhaps Dorset. The details vary by telling. He fought in Edward's Welsh campaigns of the 1280s and distinguished himself, the legend says, not by valor but by a particular willingness to do what other men would not do, to question prisoners, to extract information, to make examples. By the time Edward marched north in 1298, John Sage was a sergeant-at-arms and a known specialist. When Edward stopped at Chillingham on the way to Falkirk, he is said to have left Sage there with a small detachment, with orders to receive prisoners of war as they were sent south from the campaign and to extract from them whatever intelligence could be extracted before they were disposed of. Sage worked the dungeon, the legend says, for nearly 2 years, captured Scots, soldiers, scouts, peasants suspected of sheltering Wallace's men, women suspected of carrying messages, were brought to Chillingham in chains and lowered into the chamber. Some were ransomed back to their families. Some confessed and were hanged in the courtyard. Some, the legend says, simply did not come out at all. The 7,000 number attached to Sage's career at Chillingham, a folk memory figure with no documentary basis, is the legend's way of saying asterisk more than anyone could count asterisk. The legend has a particular set piece. It says that Sage took, from among the prisoners, a young Scottish woman whose name the legend gives variously as Mary or Margaret. He kept her in the castle. He did not return her with the other ransoms. He, in the legend's careful phrasing, asterisk, used her cruelly asterisk. After some months, the duration varies in the telling, they quarreled, and in the quarrel he killed her, and after he killed her, he attempted to dispose of her body in the chamber. The killing was discovered. Sage was reported to the king. Edward, by now back from Scotland, was furious. Not at the killing as such, the legend implies, but at the public scandal of one of his agents murdering a private prisoner outside the formal warden process. Sage was tried, condemned, and hanged at Chillingham on Edward's orders, in the autumn or winter of 1300, from a tree in the castle grounds that some local traditions still identify with a specific yew in the South Meadow. His ghost, the legend concludes, never left. The legend says he walks the dungeon corridor at night. The legend says he has been seen by Victorian guests, by 20th-century visitors, by ghost tour participants in our own time, as a tall man in dark clothing, moving past the iron grill with a slow, heavy step. The legend says the candles flicker when he passes. The legend says some visitors hear his voice, low and indistinct, and that the voice carries a southern English accent of a kind that has not existed in Northumberland for 700 years. That is the legend. Now the documented context set against it. What is documented is that Edward I did stop at Chillingham in 1298. What is documented is that the Falkirk campaign of that summer did produce a substantial number of captured Scottish prisoners, some of whom were brought into northern English custody. What is documented is that prisoners of various kinds were held at Chillingham in the years around 1300. The Grey estate accounts, in the few fragments that survive from that period, refer to the cost of feeding captives in the lower chamber. What is documented is that the system of wardens of the march, which would in later centuries make Chillingham one of the institutional torture chambers of the eastern border, was being developed in exactly these years. What is documented, in other words, is that the chamber under Chillingham's Great Hall was operational by the turn of the 14th century, that it received prisoners, and that men died in it. What we cannot verify is the name John Sage. Is the John Sage legend a folk memory of a real torturer whose name was preserved orally for 500 years before it appeared in print? It is possible. Oral memory can carry names that long, especially names attached to vivid local horror. Is the John Sage legend a Victorian invention, a piece of 19th-century antiquarian theater invented to give a face to a chamber that had been used by anonymous wardens for 3 centuries? It is also possible. The Victorian fascination with medieval cruelty and the rise of haunted tourism as a category in the second half of the 19th century would have rewarded such an invention richly. Both are possible, neither is certain. What is certain is the chamber. What is certain is that men did die in that room, by the dozens or hundreds or thousands. Across the 3 centuries the room was in use. Whether the man who killed them was named John Sage or named something else, or was a succession of unnamed men working under unnamed wardens, the chamber does not say. The chamber only remembers that they died. Sir Humphry Wakefield bought Chillingham in 1982. He was, at the time of the purchase, 46 years old. He was a baronet by inheritance. The family title goes back to the 18th century, and he had, through his marriage to Catherine Stopes Roe, a distant family connection to the Greys of Chillingham. The castle came on the market because the previous line of ownership had collapsed under death duties. It was, in 1982, a ruin in every meaningful sense. The roof had gone. The lead had been stripped from the gutters during the Second World War. The interior was open to the weather. The Great Hall was choked with debris. The grounds were overgrown. The price, the family has said publicly, was negligible. The castle was worth almost nothing in 1982, because almost no one wanted the obligations that came with it. Wakefield took the obligations. He has spent 44 years restoring the castle. He has rebuilt the roof. He has cleared the courtyards. He has restored the Great Hall, the staterooms, the chapel. He has opened the castle to the public as a paid attraction, with tours and weddings and corporate events and overnight ghost tour experiences. The income from these activities is what funds the ongoing restoration, which is still, by his own statements, only perhaps 2/3 complete. In the course of this restoration, in the early 1930s before Wakefield's tenure, and then again in the 1990s after his arrival, several discoveries were made in the lower levels of the castle that bear on what we have been discussing. The first discovery was made in 1933, during Army inspections of the partly derelict castle before the building was requisitioned for military training during the run-up to the Second World War. Workers clearing one of the lower chambers, not the main torture chamber, but a smaller adjoining room, pulled up a section of stone flagging and found, beneath it, An oubliette. An oubliette is a particular kind of medieval prison. The word is French, and it derives from the verb asterisk, oublier asterisk, to forget. The function of an oubliette is in the name. It is a narrow vertical shaft, usually entered only through a hatch at the top, into which a prisoner can be lowered and from which the prisoner cannot escape. The shaft is too deep to climb and too narrow to turn around in. The prisoner stands. He stands for as long as he can stand. When he can no longer stand, he sits or crouches in whatever space the shaft allows. He is fed, when he is fed, by food lowered on a rope. He is not generally expected to come out. The Chillingham oubliette is about 20 feet deep and roughly 3 feet square at the bottom. The shaft is rough-cut stone. There is no light. There is no ventilation except whatever air passes through the hatch when the hatch is opened. When workers opened it in 1933, the hatch had been mortared shut, possibly in the 18th century, possibly earlier. They found, at the bottom, human remains. The remains were not formally examined at the time. The 1930s were not a period in which provincial English landowners were inclined to call in archaeologists for human bones found in old castle basements. The bones were, by some accounts, removed and reburied in the castle grounds. By other accounts, they were simply left in the shaft and the hatch resealed. The exact disposition of the 1933 remains is no longer known. There is no surviving photograph, no surviving inventory. The discovery is documented in correspondence between the Grey trustees and the Northumberland county authorities, and in a small notice in a regional newspaper of the period, and that is all. What was found was bones of more than one individual, the count uncertain, perhaps 2, perhaps 3, perhaps more. The bones included long bones, ribs, and at least one skull. They were old, they were not recent. They were not, by any plausible interpretation, the remains of someone who had been put down the shaft in living memory. They were the remains of people who had been put down the shaft and forgotten about while the shaft was still in active use as a prison, which is to say, at least 300 years before they were found, and probably more. A second discovery was made in 1996 during renovations of the dungeon area under Wakefield's restoration program. A wall in the corridor outside the main torture chamber, which had been thought solid, was found to be hollow. Workers carefully removed several courses of stone and exposed a small alcove that had been sealed at an unknown date. Inside the alcove were several items: fragments of chain, the corroded blade of a knife, a small iron object that was eventually identified as a thumbscrew of late medieval design, and what appeared to be a folded leather garment so degraded that it disintegrated when touched. There were no remains in the 1996 alcove. There were only the instruments. The interpretation that the castle's curators have offered, and they have been cautious not to overstate this, is that the alcove was probably used as a working storage space for the torture chamber during periods when the chamber was operational and was sealed up at some later date, perhaps when the chamber was decommissioned in the late 17th century after the Union of the Crowns made its use politically untenable. These are the recent discoveries. They are not paranormal discoveries. They are archaeological discoveries. They are the kind of discoveries that any continuously occupied medieval English castle, examined carefully, can be expected to produce. They confirm, beyond any doubt, that the chamber was in active use as a prison and a place of corporal coercion for centuries. They do not, by themselves, prove or disprove anything about ghosts. But they do something to the ghost stories. They give the ghost stories ground to stand on. When a visitor to Chillingham, sleeping in one of the upper rooms on one of the overnight tours, reports hearing footsteps below the floor at 3 in the morning, the visitor is reporting a sensory experience. The sensory experience may be auditory hallucination. It may be the ordinary settling of an 800-year-old building in a damp Northumberland night. It may be, the believers say, something else. But the visitor is hearing footsteps in a building that has, by archaeological certainty, contained dead and dying men in its lower chambers for the larger part of its existence. The chamber is not a ghost story. The chamber is what makes the ghost story credible. There is a particular passage in the Country Life feature on Chillingham, published in 2024 as part of an architectural profile of Sir Humphry Wakefield's restoration, that has stayed with me. The interviewer is being shown the dungeon. Wakefield is leading the tour. They reach the oubliette. The interviewer, knowing the 1933 discovery, asks whether Wakefield has ever considered having the shaft formally examined by archaeologists, by forensic specialists, by anyone qualified to determine, with 21st-century methods, who the people down there were, and how they died, and how long ago. Wakefield, the interview reports, takes a long pause. He says, "I have considered it." He says, "I have decided not to do it." He says, "There are some things a building knows that it doesn't want a man to write down." That is the answer. He is not a credulous man. He is not, by background or temperament, a New Age mystic or a paranormal enthusiast. He is an English baronet of solidly establishment formation, Eton, the army, a career in the antiques trade, decades of work as a serious restorer of historic houses. He is the kind of man who, in the ordinary course of his work, calls in archaeologists routinely. The Chillingham restoration has been guided by historic preservation experts at every stage. The building has been carefully surveyed, photographed, and documented, but not the shaft. The shaft, Wakefield has chosen to leave alone. This is not a refusal to acknowledge what is there. He acknowledges it. He shows it to visitors. He describes, on the candlelit tours, what was found in 1933 and what is presumed to be there still. He is not hiding the oubliette. What he is refusing, specifically, is to subject it to forensic examination. The reason, when he gives reasons, is not paranormal. It is, in his telling, a question of dignity. The people who died in the oubliette did not die expecting to be later examined by strangers. They died expecting nothing. They died because the system of wardens, or the king's agents, or, if you believe the legend, John Sage, decided that they were inconvenient, and that the inconvenience was permanent. To exhume them now, to count them, to date them, to identify what they were eating in the months before they died, would be a further violation. The first violation was the oubliette. The second violation, Wakefield has decided, will not be administered by him. This is the official answer. There is also, the longer one talks to him, an unofficial answer. The unofficial answer is the one he gives only on quiet evenings, only when he is asked the right question by the right person, and never in formal interviews. The unofficial answer is that he believes, in some way that he cannot fully articulate even to himself, that the chamber works partly because of what is still in it, that to remove the remains, or to formalize them, or to bury them with rites and headstones, would change something about the room. The room is what it is because the dead are still in it. The room is what it is because the dead have not been allowed to leave. This is not exactly a ghost story. This is something stranger. This is the proposition that a room with a body in its floor is a different kind of room than a room without one, regardless of whether anyone alive knows about the body. The room knows. The walls know. The stones, having held the body, have changed. Wakefield, if you read him carefully across his various interviews, seems to believe something like this. He does not call it haunting, he calls it presence. He does not say the ghost of John Sage is in the chamber. He says the chamber has not forgotten what was done in it. This is the position the historical record and the folkloric record converge on. The historical record says, people died in that room, in that shaft, in that corridor, by the hundreds, across centuries, in conditions of extreme cruelty. The folkloric record says, people who died in that way leave a trace. Whether the trace is empirical, a faint physical or electromagnetic something that sensitive instruments could in principle detect, or whether the trace is psychological, a story so deep and so widely known that a visitor's mind, primed by candlelight in the chamber, manufactures the experience the chamber demands, is the question we have spent an hour failing to settle. We will not settle it in the next 30 minutes either, but we have one more layer to go before the close. We have one more ghost to introduce. And this ghost, unlike John Sage, has a documented historical basis. She has a name in the parish register, she has a tomb, and she has, the legend says, never stopped looking for what was taken from her. We have to go to the Pink Room. On the first floor of the castle, in the East Range, is a room that the family has called, for at least 200 years, the Pink Room. It is not now particularly pink. The color scheme has shifted over the centuries, and the current decoration leans more toward dusty rose and faded gold. But the name has held. It was the Pink Room when Sir Humphry's restoration began in 1982, and it was the Pink Room when his predecessors gave guided tours to Victorian guests in the 1880s. And it was, by surviving inventory records, the Pink Room as far back as the late 17th century. It is the room where the Blue Boy is said to appear. The Blue Boy story is the single most famous ghost story attached to Chillingham, and it is, in its modern form, surprisingly recent. It seems to have entered the public record in the early 20th century, though there are oblique references in family correspondence from a generation or two earlier. The story, in its standard telling, is this. A visitor, usually a guest of the Greys, occasionally a member of the family itself, would sleep in the Pink Room. Around midnight the visitor would wake. The room would be cold. There would be, at the foot of the bed, the figure of a small boy, perhaps 8 or 10 years old, dressed in clothing that looked very old and surrounded by a faint blue light that did not seem to have a source. The boy would not speak. He would not move much. He would look at the sleeper for a few seconds. He would then begin to cry, not loudly, but audibly, and the crying would slowly fade, and the figure would fade with it, and the room would warm again, and the visitor would lie awake until dawn, unable to sleep. This is the Blue Boy. He is also sometimes called the Radiant Boy because of the light. In 1925, during structural work on a wall in the Pink Room, a piece of damp masonry that needed to be opened and repaired, the workers found, sealed inside the wall, the partial skeletal remains of a small child and several fragments of what appeared to be blue cloth. The bones were old. The cloth was older than living memory. There was no documentary record explaining what they were doing in the wall. There was no parish entry. There was no family note. The bones were, by the standards of the 1920s, examined briefly, declared to be the remains of a child of perhaps 7 to 10 years of age, and reburied in the family plot in the local churchyard. After 1925, the Blue Boy was no longer reported. This is a documented chronology. The hauntings were reported through the late Victorian period and into the early 20th century. The remains were found in 1925. The remains were reburied. The hauntings, from the mid-1920s onward, stopped until 1996. In 1996, during further restoration work, the Blue Boy began to be reported again. Sir Humphry Wakefield has confirmed this in multiple interviews, including the History Hit feature and the Country Life profile. He has been careful in his language. He does not claim that the ghost is back. He says only that guests in the Pink Room, who were not warned in advance about the Blue Boy story, have on more than one occasion described, the next morning, an experience that matches the older accounts in every particular. The cold, the blue light, the crying, the child at the foot of the bed. What is in the Pink Room today, if anything is in the Pink Room, has not been explained. But the Blue Boy is not the only ghost in this part of the castle. There is also Lady Mary. Lady Mary Berkeley was a daughter of Henry Berkeley, the second Baron Berkeley of Stratton, and she married Ford Grey, the third Baron Grey of Werk, in or around the year 1670. The marriage was not happy. Ford Grey was a man of considerable political ambition and limited domestic interest. He was involved in the Whig opposition to King James II. He was implicated in the Rye House plot of 1683, a conspiracy to assassinate the king and his brother, and although he escaped the worst consequences by turning king's evidence against his fellow conspirators, the affair effectively ended his standing as a husband. Some years into the marriage, the historical record indicates that Ford Grey began an affair with his wife's sister. Lady Mary's sister, Lady Henrietta Berkeley, was significantly younger. The affair became public scandal. It is documented in court records, in pamphlets of the period, and in the surviving correspondence of several contemporary figures. It was the subject of a notorious civil trial in 1682 that became one of the great society scandals of late Stuart England. In the course of the scandal, Ford Grey and Henrietta eloped, first to the Netherlands, then elsewhere on the continent. Lady Mary was left at Chillingham with her child, abandoned, publicly humiliated, and effectively trapped. She did not, the records suggest, leave the castle much after this. She withdrew into the family rooms. She is said by the family tradition to have spent the last years of her life walking the corridors of Chillingham, alone, at all hours of the day and night, in a state of inconsolable grief. She died at Chillingham, by parish record, in 1718 or 1719. The date is slightly disputed. She is buried in the family chapel. The legend says she has not stopped walking. The legend says she walks the corridor outside the Pink Room. The legend says she walks the long gallery on the first floor. The legend says she walks at night, that her steps are heard but her figure is rarely seen, that on the occasions when she has been seen, by Victorian guests, by 20th-century visitors, by the modern ghost tour participants, she appears as a tall woman in a long gray or pale gown, her head down, her face partly turned away, moving slowly along the floor as if she is looking for something she has lost and does not, herself, remember what it was. This is a documented woman. This is a documented marriage, a documented betrayal, a documented withdrawal, a documented death. Lady Mary Berkeley existed. Her grief existed. The historical record gives us almost everything except whether she is still walking. It gives us, in other words, the same ambiguity the chamber gives us. What the chamber remembers and what Lady Mary remembers are different things. The chamber remembers what was done to strangers. Lady Mary remembers what was done to her. But the structure of the remembering, the proposition that this castle holds, somehow, what happened in it, and surfaces what it holds when someone is sleeping above it at 3 in the morning, is the same structure. The Greys built the castle to keep the violence of the border out. The castle, perhaps, did not entirely succeed. Or perhaps the castle let the violence in by the front door, in the persons of Edward Longshanks and his sergeants-at-arms, in the persons of the Wardens of the March, in the person of one unhappy nobleman who married a wife and then ran off with her sister. And the castle, like all old buildings, took what was put into it, and kept some of it. On the 24th of March, 1603, in a private bedchamber in Richmond Palace, outside London, Queen Elizabeth I of England died. She was 69 years old. She had ruled for 44 years. She had never married, and she had left no heir of her body. Her successor was already on his way south. James Stuart, the sixth of his name to be King of Scotland, was 36 years old. He had been King of Scotland in name since the age of 13 months and in person since his teens. He was the great-great-grandson of Henry VII of England through his maternal line, which gave him, on Elizabeth's death, the strongest dynastic claim to the English throne. The English Privy Council confirmed him as king within hours of Elizabeth's death. He left Edinburgh for London on the 5th of April, 1603, and he was crowned King of England as James I at Westminster Abbey on the 25th of July. The two crowns, English and Scottish, were now on one head. The political consequences of this would unfold over the next century. They would include, eventually, the formal political union of England and Scotland in 1707, the creation of the United Kingdom, and the modern political settlement of Great Britain. They would also include, in their early phase, a settling of accounts on the border. James knew the border. He had been King of Scotland during the worst decades of the late Reiver period. He had seen from Edinburgh what the border families did to his Scottish subjects. He had also developed, during his English progression in 1603, when he traveled south from Edinburgh to London, a particular dislike for the part of his journey that took him through the border country. He had been forced to ride with heavy guard. He had been forced to camp under arms. He had been forced to acknowledge, as the new king of both kingdoms, that the territory between them was effectively ungoverned. He decided to fix this. The campaign against the Reivers, between 1603 and roughly 1620, was the most concentrated and ruthless act of state pacification any English or Scottish monarch had directed at the border in 300 years. James used the legal fact that he was now sovereign over both sides of the Tweed to do what neither crown alone had ever been able to do. He hanged the leaders of the great Reiver surnames. He confiscated their estates. He sent royal commissions through the border country with executive authority to summarily try and execute suspected Reivers without ordinary process of law. He transported entire families to Ireland, to the new plantation of Ulster, where their willingness to fight became briefly useful to him. The Armstrongs were broken. The Elliots were broken. The Grahams were entirely uprooted from the debatable lands and forcibly resettled, first in Ireland and then, when that failed, scattered across England in small groups, specifically chosen to prevent them from reconstituting as a family unit. By 1620, the Reiver country was, by any meaningful measure, finished. This was, on the whole, a good thing for the people who lived in the border country. The ordinary tenants, the farmers and tradesmen and small landholders who had been raided for 3 centuries, could finally, after 12 generations, sleep without listening for hooves. It was a more complicated thing for the castles. Chillingham, as a fortress, had been built for a problem that no longer existed. The torture chamber, as a working facility, had been built for a problem that no longer existed. The strategic purpose of the place. The reason the Greys had been important, the reason the Wardens had used the dungeon, the reason the king had stopped here on his way to break Scotland, had simply evaporated. The Greys remained. They held the title of Earl of Tankerville, a title in the Peerage of England awarded in 1695, and they continued to be a substantial English noble family. But Chillingham itself became in the 18th century increasingly peripheral to their lives. They had other houses, they had property in London, they had estates in other parts of England that were more productive and more conveniently situated. Chillingham was a remote ancestral seat in a backwater of a country that no longer mattered militarily. It was visited, it was maintained, it was occasionally redecorated. Queen Victoria stayed at Chillingham in 1849 on a tour of Northumberland, and the family scrambled to refurbish the staterooms in time for her visit, an exertion that left the castle, for a brief period in the mid-19th century, in better condition than it had been in for 200 years. But the visit was an exception. The trend was downward. By the late 19th century, the castle was beginning to deteriorate. The lead on the roof was thinning, the window frames were rotting, the damp was rising in the walls. The earls, increasingly absentee, were unwilling to spend the very large sums that would have been required to arrest the decay. By the time of the First World War, the castle was effectively a part-time residence at best. By the Second World War, it was something worse than that. The Second World War came to Chillingham in two stages. The first stage was the requisition. The British Army, requiring training grounds and billeting facilities across the country, requisitioned Chillingham in 1940 for use as a barracks. The exact units stationed there varied across the war years, but at various points the castle housed elements of the Royal Artillery, the Royal Engineers, and, briefly, a detachment of Czech soldiers in exile. The army was not, by inclination or by orders, a careful tenant. The staterooms were used as dormitories. The Great Hall was used as a mess. The chapel was used for storage. The grounds were churned up by vehicles. Several outbuildings were knocked down to clear lines of fire for training exercises. By the time the army withdrew in 1945, the castle was in worse physical condition than it had been at the start of the war. This would have been recoverable. The second stage was not. The British state, in the immediate post-war period, levied a series of taxes on landed estates that had the cumulative effect, intended or not, of breaking up the great country house portfolio of the English aristocracy. The most consequential of these was death duty, an inheritance tax applied at progressively higher rates on the transfer of large estates between generations. By the early 1950s, death duty on a substantial English country estate could reach 80% of the estate's assessed value. For a family whose assets were primarily in the form of land and a large house, assets that produced relatively little annual income and could only be liquidated by sale, death duty at that level was unsupportable. The 5th Earl of Tankerville died in 1931. The 6th Earl died in 1971. The 7th and last Earl died in 1980. Across these three deaths, the death duty assessed on the family estate accumulated to a sum that the family could not pay. The response, in stages across the 1930s, the 1950s, and the 1970s, was forced disposal. In 1936, to meet earlier debts and tax obligations, the family had the lead stripped from large portions of the castle roof and sold for scrap metal. The market for lead was good in the late 1930s, with rearmament demand rising across Europe. The sum raised was significant. The consequence was that, by 1940, when the army arrived, large parts of the castle roof were already open to the weather. Rainwater had been entering the upper floors for 4 years. The damage to the plasterwork, the timber, and the structural integrity of several rooms was already advanced. By the 1950s, with no one able to afford the repairs, the castle was deteriorating rapidly. Photographs from this period show trees growing in courtyards, plaster falling from ceilings in the staterooms, ivy climbing the interior of the Great Hall. The dungeon, sealed off and below ground, was the only part of the building that was substantially weatherproof. The torture chamber, ironically, was the best preserved room in the castle through this period. By the 1970s, the castle was, in any practical sense, derelict. The last Earl of Tankerville, dying in 1980, left an estate so encumbered with death duty that the family had no choice but to sell. The title passed to a cadet branch and continues to exist on paper, but the castle and the estate were put on the market separately. The estate, the surrounding land, the famous Chillingham wild cattle, the woods, was sold to a separate owner. The castle, the ruin itself, sat unsold for nearly 2 years. It sat, specifically, waiting for someone who wanted a roofless 800-year-old fortress with a documented torture chamber and a blue boy and a Lady Mary and an oubliette of uncertain contents. In the summer of 1982, someone arrived. His name was Sir Humphry Wakefield. He was, as we have noted, a baronet by inheritance and an antiques dealer by trade. He had the connection to the Greys through his marriage. He had been quietly looking at Chillingham for several years, watching the price come down, waiting for the moment when the family would accept that no normal buyer was coming. He took the keys, signed the papers, and began the work that he is still doing. The deal Sir Humphry made with Chillingham was, on its face, a deal about money. He could not pay for the restoration out of his own pocket. No one could. The full restoration of an 800-year-old fortress with multiple roof failures and centuries of accumulated damp would, by realistic estimates in the mid-1980s, have required somewhere between £5 and £10 million, a sum that exceeded the personal wealth of all but the very richest English landowners and far exceeded Wakefield's. He needed the castle to pay for its own restoration. He needed, in other words, a business model. The business model he found, and has since refined into one of the most successful operations of its kind in Britain, was the haunted tourism business model. He would open Chillingham to the public. He would charge admission. He would run tours. He would conduct by candlelight after dark, with full theatrical attention to atmosphere, ghost tours that emphasized the dungeon and the pink room and the long gallery and the chamber. He would allow paying guests to stay overnight in the most reputedly haunted rooms. He would, in time, host weddings and corporate events and television documentaries. Every pound of admission and overnight fee and event income would go back into the building. The ghosts, in this arrangement, would pay for their own house. The Independent on Sunday, in a 2004 feature, ranked Chillingham among the top 50 castles in Europe, partly on the basis of its restoration, partly on the basis of its haunted reputation. The two were, by then, inseparable. The castle was famous because it was haunted. The hauntings were elaborate because the castle was famous. The two reinforced each other, and both reinforced the income that kept the roof on. This is the bargain. It is a real bargain. It is a bargain that has, by any measurable standard, worked. Chillingham today is a working castle in a way it has not been since the 17th century. The roof is on, the walls are sound, the staterooms are restored, the grounds are maintained. The building, after 70 years of decay, has been pulled back from the edge of complete ruin and is now, again, what it was for most of its existence, an inhabited English fortress. But the bargain has a cost that the financial accounting does not capture. The cost is what the ghosts now mean. Before 1982, the ghosts of Chillingham were a family matter. They were stories the Greys told each other in private. They were occasional disturbances in the night. They were, in their 19th-century form, the kind of half-believed tradition that an English noble family kept around because the keeping of such traditions was part of what it meant to be an English noble family. After 1982, the ghosts are a product. They have a website, they have brochures, they have a tour schedule. They have, increasingly, a relationship to the visiting public that resembles the relationship between an attraction and its consumers more than it resembles the relationship between a place and the people who happen to live in it. This is not Wakefield's fault. He inherited a building that would not have survived without this transformation. He has been, in his stewardship of the ghosts, more careful and more dignified than most operators in his position would have been. He does not invent ghost stories. He does not embellish. He tells the documented legends and acknowledges, on the record, which parts of them are folklore and which parts can be supported by the archaeological evidence. He has been, by the standards of the haunted tourism industry, scrupulous. But the ghosts are now in the world differently. They are no longer the Greys' ghosts. They are everyone's ghosts. They are anyone's who buys a ticket. And what this means, in some way that none of us, not Wakefield, not the visitors, not the chamber itself, fully understands, is something we cannot tell you with certainty. It may mean that the ghosts have been honored by being shared, that the dead of the dungeon, finally, after 700 years, have an audience, that John Sage, whether or not he existed, has at last been named, and the children of the oubliette and Lady Mary in her grief and the blue boy at the foot of his bed have been heard. It may mean the opposite. It may mean that the ghosts have been cheapened, that to walk the chamber by candlelight as a paying customer, with a ticket and a guide and a gift shop at the exit, is to do something to the dead that the dead did not consent to. Wakefield, when he is asked this question directly, does not answer it. He gives different answers on different nights. He is, on this point, the wisest man in the castle, because the question does not have a single answer, and a single answer would be a lie. And a lie in this room, in this particular room, with these particular dead, is not a thing he is willing to commit. There is one more fact about Sir Humphry Wakefield that we have already mentioned and need to return to, because it is the fact this video has been circling toward from the first minute. He has stopped sleeping in the castle. He owns the castle. He has owned the castle for 44 years. He has spent the most productive period of his adult life inside it. He has lived in it. He has eaten in it. He has worked in it. He has restored it room by room. He has, by his own statements, slept in nearly every bedroom in the building at one point or another across the decades. He no longer sleeps in any of them. He lives, when he is at Chillingham, in a cottage on the grounds. The cottage is comfortable and well appointed, and has, by every indication, no haunting attached to it. It is a few hundred yards from the castle. He walks across in the morning to begin the day's work. He walks back in the evening when the work is done. The castle, for him, is now a place he visits, not a place he resides. He has given various explanations for this over the years. He has said it is the cold. The castle is large and difficult to heat, and the cottage is more practical for an older man. He has said it is the noise. The castle, even when empty of visitors, has the ordinary auditory busyness of an 800-year-old building settling and resettling in the weather. He has said it is the routine. The cottage is closer to the gate and the road and the workshops, and his daily life simply functions better from there. All of these explanations are plausible. All of them may be true. Once, in an interview with the Telegraph some years ago, he gave a different answer. He was asked the question directly. He was asked whether he had stopped sleeping in the castle because of the ghosts. He paused. He thought about it. He gave an answer that the journalist quoted in full and that has been reprinted occasionally since. He said, the journalist reports, "A man can hear a castle if he listens long enough, and some castles are louder than others." That was the answer. He did not elaborate. He did not say what the castle was telling him. He did not say which ghost, or which room, or which night had been the one too many. He left it at the sentence and moved on to the next question. But the sentence has stayed. It has stayed because it is, in its way, the most honest thing anyone has said about Chillingham in 800 years. The castle is loud, not loud in the literal sense, though it has, on still nights, its own creaks and settlings, as all old buildings do. Loud in the other sense, the sense in which a place can speak, the sense in which the accumulated experience of a building over centuries can, in some way the modern world is not equipped to measure, become a kind of presence. The sense in which the chamber and the oubliette and the pink room and the long gallery are not empty rooms, but rooms with weight, rooms with history physically present in them, rooms that, to a man who has lived alongside them for 40 years, eventually become rooms that cannot be slept in. Wakefield sleeps in the cottage. The castle, every night, is left to itself, and whatever happens in the chamber, in the small hours, when the staff have gone home and the visitors have gone back to their hotels and the cottage lights are out across the lawn, whatever happens in the chamber happens with no one to witness it. Except, perhaps, the witnesses who never left. Sir Humphry Wakefield has owned Chillingham for 44 years. He has rebuilt the roof, he has restored the Great Hall, he has cleared the moat, he has done what no Grey did for 2 centuries before him. The castle is no longer a ruin. He has also stopped sleeping inside it. He is asked about this often. On the candlelit tours he still occasionally leads. He gives different answers on different nights. Sometimes he says it's the cold. Sometimes he says he simply prefers the cottage on the grounds. Once, asked by a journalist from the Telegraph, he said only this, that a man can hear a castle if he listens long enough, and that some castles are louder than others. There are two ways to hear Chillingham. You can hear the blue boy at the foot of the pink room bed, and the grey lady in the pantry, and the footsteps of John Sage on the stone of the dungeon floor. You can hear Lady Mary walking the long gallery in the small hours, looking for the sister who left and the husband who left, and the life that was taken from her without her consent. You can hear the dead, or you can hear the Reivers riding out at moonrise. You can hear the women of 3 centuries of border villages waking up to smoke on the horizon. You can hear the prisoners in the cells beneath your feet, who, in the records of the Wardens of the Marches, simply stop appearing one day, with no note made of where they went. You can hear the bones in the oubliette that no one has counted because no one wants to know how many. You can hear the living and what the living did. Maybe these are two different sounds. Maybe they are the same sound, and we have only invented two ways of hearing it because the truth, told plainly, would be more than we can carry. The castle does not say. The yew trees do not say. Sir Humphry sleeps in the cottage. The torture chamber is still there. The instruments are still on the wall. The oubliette is still sealed under its flagstone, with whatever it contains. The pink room is still kept, in the warmer months, for guests who do not know what they are sleeping above. And whatever the chamber remembers, it has not finished remembering it yet. Next time, we travel south, to Devon, to another castle that families simply walked away from. A ruin in deep woods. 2 ghosts, 2 centuries of silence, and one question the family that lived there for 500 years never answered. Why, in 1688, did they leave?